Coming up, the Sky News Daily. Martial law declared, then quickly reversed. Just what is going on in South Korea? Look, it is usually seen as rather more sensible than its neighbour to the north, but South Korea was plunged into crisis late on Tuesday night when President Yoon declared martial law. Now, protests, of course, took place almost immediately, and then martial law was pretty quickly withdrawn. I'm Neil Paterson, and on this edition of The Daily, we are asking what on earth is going on in South Korea. Our correspondent on the ground in Seoul is Cordelia Lynch. Cordelia, it looks like it's all calmed down a bit, is that right?
Yeah, it has, after a very chaotic 24 hours here in Seoul. And tonight, despite the freezing cold temperatures here, we've seen thousands on the street and outside the National Assembly holding vigils, demanding that the president step down. But this was just an extraordinary moment in South Korean history, and one no one saw coming.
For those who haven't been to South Korea before, tell us just a little bit more about the place.
I mean, Seoul itself, where I am, is a sort of heady mix of the ancient and modernity. You've got these incredible streets packed with restaurants, thriving musical culture. You've got a lot of colourful architecture. There's also a strong political pulse to it. Protest is a part of the culture here, but there's also this kind of reserved nature to the culture too. And I think as a city and as a country, I think it is always a place that is very worried about returning to the dark days of military dictatorship, but it also embraces a lot of the new when it comes to technology, new movements in culture as well. It's an exciting, fascinating place, but also a very orderly place.
So let's go back to last night. South Korea's president popping up on national television, making what I think is fair to say was an unexpected announcement of martial law being imposed.
Yeah, deeply unexpected. And the justification, Neil, that he gave was that this was necessary because of the North Korean communist threat and, as he described it, anti-state forces. He also talked about the opposition party and the government as a criminal den. So this was really framed by him as something he had no choice in, that he had to move quickly, and there was no real prelude to it. You know, this was a late night, 11th hour address by the president that took the whole world by surprise.
So for South Korea, what would martial law have looked like?
Well, martial law is something that is imposed to take over from civilian government. It enables effectively the military to have a lot more power, and it can lead to civilian rights being kind of temporarily curtailed. In this case, we saw very quickly the kind of military move to stop political protest. Journalists were also being brought under this particular military rule as well, but it was temporary. Ultimately, it only lasted 6 hours, but the threat of that was considered extremely serious. And I think that's why we saw so many, thousands of people taking to the streets so swiftly. We saw those images of the military outside and inside the National Assembly trying to stop, blockade ultimately, lawmakers getting inside the Parliament itself.
Just how exactly did the politicians get inside Parliament then?
They did manage to get through, but Neil, they had to scale fences, they had to jump barricades, they had to push against the army in order to get inside of that building. And the decision, once they got inside, was unanimous to overturn this decision by the president. They were supported too by a lot of ordinary people who were standing outside shouting against the president.
Does President Yoon have any support for his actions, or are we seeing condemnation from across the spectrum?
Well, we heard whispers today of a kind of support rally for him. I haven't seen any evidence of that so far. I have seen a lot of people saying that this was a stupid, highly risky manoeuvre and one that he's hugely misjudged and will pay for.
And once again on the Sky News Daily podcast, we're talking about a president and the possibility of impeachment, except this time it's the president of South Korea.
Yeah, quite. And that impeachment, the proceedings are already underway, Neil, and we're told that there could be a vote on it Thursday, possibly Friday. In order for him to be impeached, it will take 200 out of 300 in Parliament to vote for it. That would mean that some within his own party would have to vote for his impeachment. I think that is not impossible. There was plenty of criticism when he made this move to impose martial law. His leadership has been a deeply turbulent time for South Korea. So impeachment is a real, genuine risk for him right now.
Well, clearly the events of Tuesday night didn't come out of thin air. So what do we know about the man who called martial law in the first place?
President Yoon, before becoming president, had precisely zero experience as a career politician. He served as special prosecutor in the last administration of then President Moon Jae-in, and he was appointed by President Moon to effectively clean up politics.
John Nilsson-Wright is head of the Japan and Korea's programme at the Centre for Geopolitics at Cambridge University. He himself lives in Seoul.
The irony is that he's now been forced out of office, or he will be, I'm sure, once the impeachment measures proceed, precisely because of allegations that were similar to those that he was charged with cleaning up in the past.
Tell us then just a little bit more about those scandals that have beset his presidency and in particular his wife as well.
Well, the allegations surrounding his wife are probably in some ways the most damaging. She has been a controversial figure because it's alleged that she had too much influence as First Lady over the president in making decisions. But it's also allegations surrounding insider trading, which, if the allegations are to be believed, ensured that she made substantial financial gains. There have been other, what one might describe as more minor scandals involving claims that she received gifts, in particular a handbag that was not declared. That might sound like very small bore stuff, but the perception that this is an unaccountable citizen who, because of her proximity to the president, has been allowed to get away with influence peddling and financial corruption has been a source of great displeasure. But on top of that is the perception that President Yoon has not, in the 2.5 years or so that he's been president, been very effective in dealing with a whole raft of domestic political issues, including a labour dispute involving medical doctors. President Yoon seemed to be very incapable of managing that issue. And despite a lot of activity on the world stage in terms of South Korea's foreign and diplomatic policies, domestically at home, he was seen as politically tin-eared and arguably fairly incompetent.
I mean, ahead of the announcement of martial law, what had all that done for his popularity and indeed his ability to govern, his ability to be president?
Created it. Opinion polls were demonstrating that he was flatlining in the low teens, getting perilously close to a position where his poll numbers would have been below 10%. And this was raising questions about whether he could in fact govern. That, combined with these allegations, was making it very difficult for him to be seen to be popular. And then on the back of losing the National Assembly elections, which gave the opposition party a much needed boost in their standing, President Yoon had come out and said, look, I'm going to govern in a more humble way. I'm going to listen to what the people have said. Well, he has demonstrated that he is doing anything but that. And then this extraordinary statement when he made the martial law announcement, claiming that anti-state actors, in his words, aligned with North Korea was the implication, namely the opposition party themselves, were somehow undemocratic and illegitimate, and therefore he was justified in calling for the implementation of martial law.
So you see this was all about political survival?
Yes, there was no claim whatsoever that could substantiate this extraordinary suggestion. Now, this did not come out of the blue. If you look back at past statements by the president, 2 years ago, the president gave a speech on August 15th. National Liberation Day marks the day that Korea itself, the entire Korea Peninsula, was liberated from Japan's colonial rule that had lasted for 35 years at the end of World War II. Every year, that speech that any president makes is an important one. But 2 years ago, President Yoon was already using the sort of rhetoric to demonize the opposition, claiming that they were North Korean fellow travelers and therefore disloyal and unpatriotic, was already a sign that he was prepared to intensify the fierce partisanship that has been characteristic of South Korean politics for a number of years. And this idea perhaps explains why he felt that there was a kind of perverse logic to what he was doing in attacking the opposition so aggressively.
John, can we just take a step back for a second? What is the significance of South Korea to those of us in the West, particularly the United States, who were not told by President Yoon that martial law was going to be declared?
I mean, it represents one of the most precariously placed parts on the planet because of the proximity of a nuclear-armed North Korea, because of the risk of conflict emerging on the Korean Peninsula. South Korea, of course, a hugely important ally to the United States. And because of that, foreign policy issues are really, really important. But beyond that, South Korea, of course, has increasingly become, in the words of the Yoon administration, a global pivotal state, using its economic and foreign policy activism to support the United States and the rule of law internationally, ironically, given, of course, what we've seen in the last 24 hours, in support of liberal democracies across the world, and, of course, doing its bit to push back against Russia's aggression in Ukraine. Because of all of those reasons, if the Yoon administration had been minded to inform the United States, I think the first response of the United States as South Korea's critical ally, with 28,500 US troops on the Korean Peninsula, would have been to try and dissuade the president from going ahead with this. South Korea is a sovereign state, but this action by President Yoon was clearly a breach of all the rules of domestic politics and would have been seen as a retrograde step by the Americans. The Biden administration has prioritized from the get-go its relationship with its two primary allies in Northeast Asia, South Korea and Japan. Just last year, of course, they had the very important announcement of the so-called Camp David Accord that brought together the leaders of South Korea, Japan, and the United States in Camp David for a very practically important and symbolic affirmation of a new trilateral, in effect, de facto alliance partnership. And that was designed, I think, to shore up alliance, to enhance cooperation between those three liberal democratic states to deal with immediate security threats in the region, but also globally. And that was driven by the fear of what a Trump administration might do. The South Koreans are bracing for an incoming administration that is going to put them under a lot of pressure. They're also worried that Donald Trump may be minded to repeat what he did in 2018 in reaching out to the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, who he has professed a great deal of admiration, if not love for. Speculation is that he will revisit that, and he may be prepared to offer to the North Koreans very important concessions, maybe perhaps as much as acknowledging that North Korea is a de facto nuclear power, in return for perhaps an agreement that North Korea will limit the range of its long-range ballistic missiles so they cannot target the United States. That would be, in theory, good for the US. It would leave South Korea worryingly exposed to the much more immediate security risks that North Korea poses. So for the South Koreans, the concern is that they will be marginalized and left out of any potential future negotiations between Pyongyang and Washington.
How has it been seen by those competing powers, let's call them, North Korea, China?
This is a win for the authoritarian regimes that have partnered with North Korea, particularly for Russia. The North Koreans themselves, in terms of their media response, have been relatively muted so far. I think that's partly because, as an authoritarian regime, North Korea doesn't want to broadcast the fact that people power can sometimes be very effective in challenging governments that are seen as illegitimate and unrepresentative. And for China, again, I think anything that weakens the United States and its alliances in this part of the world is seen as welcome. So confusion in Seoul, confusion in South Korea, doubts about the reliability of democratic governance, after all, is grist to the mill for authoritarian leaders who want to present themselves as representatives of a different type of order and a different type of political legitimacy.
John, do you think that we in the West pay enough attention to what happens inside South Korea? And I realise I'm asking an expert on South Korea this very question.
I think so. I mean, obviously I look at this from the perspective of someone who's spent many years studying the subject, and the community of Korea watchers is, I think, quite extensive. There is, of course, the added, I think, impetus now that has come out of Korea's soft power that means that for many people in Europe, in the United States, Korea is increasingly seen as an attractive model of successful culture, whether it's K-pop, Korean football stars, Korean dramas, Korean film. All of this, I think, has created this extraordinary boom. We've had a Korean writer win the Nobel Prize for Literature this year. Korea is definitely on people's minds. And of course, the security issues. Given the ever-present threat from North Korea, one can't help but notice the Korean question, because it is now a global one, not just a regional one. There are lots of reasons why the Korean issue remains, critically important. And the West, I think, is doing what it can, but it's not always possible to act in a way that is going to deliver immediate results, which is why any instability in South Korea, prompted by the events of the last few hours, is undoubtedly a bad thing.
For much more on what is happening up to the minute in South Korea, just head to skynews.com. We're back again, same time tomorrow.